All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with the next panel, the one that everybody's been waiting for, to discuss funding of all this new equipment and automation to make this all work for us. I know Bill Ayer talked about passion and buy-in and ownership, and I think we're all pretty clear that we all have that, but the question is, do we have the right funding mechanism in place? After the last few years of over 20 short-term extensions of FAA reauthorization, the 2-week partial shutdown in 2011, sequestration that we're currently under, controller furloughs, luckily those ended, the sequestration, which delayed many, if not all, of the NextGen programs that we're here talking about, and proposed tower closures. And all of that is to the detriment of any progress that we want to see out of these programs. So I want to go through and have everybody introduce themselves, do a couple of short, or just a short opening remark, 3 to 5 minutes, and then I have a question to start it off, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, similar to the last panel that I moderated. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions and discussions around this topic. So to my left is Captain Lee Moak, President of Airline Pilots Association International.
Thanks, Steve. I am the president of the Airline Pilots Association. NextGen is very important to our members. As you've heard today, and many of you already know, and I think Bill did a great job in his remarks, NextGen is a complex system. It requires a lot of detail, and it is expensive. However, it's necessary, and doing part of it is not an option. So part of the overall planning and programming has to be a commitment for sustained and adequate funding. Funding that is free and independent of Washington political gamesmanship. We just experienced a situation due to sequestration. Our air transportation system was in a large part held hostage by these partisan politics. We have to recognize that some of the early benefits of NextGen are not to our airlines, but to the FAA and to the federal government. Nevertheless, the airlines need to equip if we're going to realize the potential safety and efficiency benefits of NextGen. The NextGen initiatives and fundings of the air traffic system in the United States rely on, in part, government funding from taxpayer dollars. The balance comes from a patchwork of taxes and fees from the airlines. Right now, airlines pay the majority of the cost for operating the national airspace system, and reducing the tax burden on our employers, I believe, would help our industry. All users will reap the benefits, and all should bear a fair share of the costs. The airlines cannot operate, they cannot afford to pay the cost of this operation and maintaining our current system, along with the additional expense to purchase avionics equipment that may not realize its full benefit for many years. So we need to plan to pay for both operating the existing ATC system and modernizing the NAS without driving our airlines out of the business. As such, ALPA opposes any new commercial aviation user taxes, which are often disguised as fees, and calls on Congress to level the playing field as it relates to airline taxes. Obviously, one way to make a positive business case is to show a return on the investment for airlines that take that step to put the technology on their aircraft, develop the procedures, and train the crews to take advantage of NextGen, the concepts with that, and the capabilities that are already available. That's why we're here today, to explore ways that we can get more action and definable results from all the strategic planning that's gone on before. We have to find ways to reward airlines who are the leaders in NextGen. If they're going to invest in technology, they have to see a benefit. We can't keep sending airplanes to the boneyard with advanced technology that's never been used. We need commitment from the government, and that commitment should be part of a national aviation policy, a national airline policy, a policy to level the playing field for our airlines. That national aviation policy must start with a complete review and overhaul of the aviation taxes and fees paid by the airlines. In addition, This policy must include recommendations on how we fund and structure our air traffic system in order to create some sort of independence and isolate it from the politics of Washington, while also giving the users a strong voice in the key decisions needed in order to modernize the system. Remember, we're here today to talk about perspectives on NextGen. As a pilot, I'm tired of seeing equipment in my airplane that I can't use, either because the supporting infrastructure isn't there, or because the procedures haven't been developed, or the training hasn't happened. It's time to have the conversation about how to do best equipped, best served, into a way to show benefits for early adopters without damaging the industry overall. We don't have all the answers, but if we don't have this conversation, don't have these summits, these forums where we can put everything on the table and talk about it, we'll never move closer to solutions. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Lee. And next to Lee's left is Paul Rinaldi, President of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association.
Thanks, Steve. Funding of the National Airspace System, and those might think that my organization has pivoted to open up the discussion and see exactly what is the best way to fund this system, and we actually have. There's a game changer out there, and it's called the sequester. When you could see the FAA closing 149 air traffic control towers, not because of safety, but because to save money, to tell 10% of the air traffic controllers to go home, not because of safety, but because to save money. You look at a restriction in the national airspace system, you look at delays for no apparent reason, you look at the funding system that is generating this economic engine, and you go, we should have this discussion. I don't have the answers. As Lee said, we don't have all the answers. We don't have any of the answers. But I do know that the current system is broken, and this conversation needs to start to happen. I know they're happening in closed doors, behind closed doors. I know people are talking about it. How do we get to this point? But we should bring this discussion to the forefront, have it as adults with the passion of a growing, thriving aviation system, making sure that we can accommodate all users, from the single-engine Cessna pilot to the 777 flying across the pond, and making sure that we're not strangling the airlines, especially the airlines of this country, because the competition, I think when we talked about NextGen, we talked about, well, in 10 years or 15 years, we're going to see, a growing airline community. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to actually see that growing airline community from within the United States. I think the competition is coming from overseas, and we could start to actually see that going on there. If we do not mature, have this discussion, find a way to sustainably fund this system properly so that we can modernize it, we are going to fall way behind the world. Senator Rockefeller often jokes that we're just behind Mongolia in air traffic control system. I'm fearful that if we don't address this, that actually might become an accurate statement as you look at NAV Canada and you look at the technology that they're investing, and you go, they might be able to actually run the oceans more efficient than the United States. And would they actually take the oceans over? And then what kind of negative impact will that have on United States Airlines? And what kind of negative impact would it have on if they took the Caribbean and then took the Gulf? And then said, oh, by the way, we could actually do Florida also because we have the Caribbean and the Gulf, and start piecemealing our system out. Now is the time for us to have this discussion. Now is the time for us to invest in our future. We all love aviation. We all have a passion for aviation. And everybody in this room should have ownership to have this discussion and see exactly which is the best way to fund this system so it grows, so it thrives, so it continues to be the economic engine in this country, the job creator it is. Every single one of us owe it to the aviation system because we all make our living here. And we all have that passion about aviation. And that's all this is right now. It's not, oh, NATCA is signing up for privatization. Oh, NATCA is signing up for this. We're signing up for the discussion, not behind closed doors, but in the forefront. How do we fund this system properly? Randy Babbitt had this great analogy, and I use it a lot. Randy has the ultimate perspective of aviation, from sitting in your chair to being the administrator to actually being a private consultant to now being a VP at Southwest Airlines. And he said the current funding system for capital projects is, if NextGen was a shed, in 2010, we say we're going to build NextGen and it's this shed. 2011, Congress would appropriate some 2x4s to build this shed, and they would sit there. And in 2012, Congress would appropriate some 2x6s for this NextGen project. And in 2013, there'll be some nails, and we could actually start to look at what framing is. And in 2014, there would be some plywood that we'd put up some walls. And in 2015, a brand new Congress would come in and say, that is an old piece of crap, and we're not putting any more money to it. And that's the reality that we have today. When we just listened to Bill talking about, this is the technology we're trying to do today has been around since 1995. And technology is forever changing. So we have to find a sustainable way to move forward, a funding system that we can invest in the infrastructure, a funding system that we can have an aviation system grow, and we can all prosper, and we can continue to be the world leader. And that's what we're signing up for the conversation.
Thanks, Paul. Next to Paul is Robert Poole, Searle Freedom Trust Transportation Fellow and Director of Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation.
Thanks very much, Steve. And I couldn't ask for a better setup for what I'm going to say than what Paul has just said, because there is really a growing consensus that the funding system is broken. I can't tell you how many people I've heard that from over the last 6 months in particular. One of the things that really shocked me that's gotten almost no discussion is that when OMB made the rules for how the sequester would apply to FAA, AIP was exempt, but facilities and equipment was not. I mean, when the Aviation Trust Fund was created, it was to safeguard the money that aviation user taxes put in to be for infrastructure for aviation, which meant the air traffic control system and the airports. Well, that's clearly gone by the boards somehow. A lot of other people that are really experts on the federal budget look at the FAA budget in a time of shrinking federal resources and look, what's the most likely outcome? Well, there's only a few accounts. Congress loves AIP. Operations, you've got to keep the people employed and doing their jobs. The fall guy is always going to be facilities and equipment. It gets the short end of the stick. It's the easiest thing to cut. Short term, it's not that big. Long term, of course, it's a disaster. But Congress, politicians live for the short term, not for the long term. We have to live in a world of the real world of long term. The problem, it's been mentioned that we've had the idea that this ragbag of taxes is a reliable funding source, is really falsified by history. We've had suspension of those aviation taxes in 1981, 82, 95, and 2011, when it was even worse, when we had a partial shutdown of the FAA in 2011. Also, for the taxing ticket prices and fuel, those are both resources that are not really growing. Airlines, to the great credit of creative business people, are figuring out how to put less and less into the ticket price, which is what's taxed. So that's not growing in pace with the actual flights. Likewise, all the impetus in aircraft design and operational procedures is toward lower fuel consumption. So if you tax fuel, you're going to get less and less in proportion to how the system grows. So that's broken. Basically, there's also something, if you ask economists who understand long-lived infrastructure, how should you pay for that? The idea that you pay for a $20 billion infrastructure project out of annual operating cash flow is nuts. You wouldn't run any business that way. You wouldn't certainly run an electric utility that way. Almost all other major infrastructure, airports, electricity, pipelines, railroads, they fund major capital expenditures mostly out of bonding. They finance this, just like you finance when you buy your house. But to do that, you have to have a reliable revenue stream, one that you can count on year after year, not something that's at the political whim of Congress to decide whether it's there and how much it's going to be. Now, there's a few other concerns that set the stage for suggesting that we really need to rethink the whole system. We know that I've been reading GAO reports about FAA procurement for about 25 years, And you read the ones from 25 years ago about the NAS plan and various things, all the same things that are being said today in GAO and Inspector General reports about the terrible procurement capabilities of FAA. I mean, it's not only FAA's fault. This is a lot of faults because of micromanagement by Congress and funding and so forth. But that's broken also. As wonderful as the NAC is, and I really think it's been a tremendous step forward of everybody getting together and working on priorities, the NAC is only advisory. You should have that kind of consensus, actually making the decisions about what the user community is, where's the business cases, what is the user stakeholder community willing to support and work together to bring about. But an advisory only, while it's a step in the right direction, doesn't really get you where you need to go. And Congress continues to insert, for good or for ill, its own priorities every time they legislate. They set their own deadlines for things that should be done. Maybe they make sense, but a lot of times they don't. Congress acts as if it's the board of directors for this system, when what we're seeing around the world is different kinds of boards of directors. And so my message today, not a new message, but I think it's more timely than ever, is that we need funding reform and the big governance reform, how decisions get made about what this air traffic control system does, what priority, what things to do when. The Management Advisory Council of the FAA, on which Paul sits, in March of this year sent a letter to the senior members of Congress dealing with aviation saying that the funding system is broken and really needs to be replaced, and recommended things like a dependable 10-year funding plan, a new sustainable revenue source, and they sort of hinted at maybe one that would be bondable, and a governing board, mind you, of aviation stakeholders that would make policy and set priority. And I think that is a huge step in the right direction. But other countries have gone further. The pattern over the last 25 years in country after country has been to separate the air traffic provider from the safety regulator, because those are two very, very different jobs, and enable the air traffic provider to be self-supporting from revenues that are paid by the customers, by the people that fly planes, directly to the provider, which gives the bondable revenue stream that allows for issuing revenue bonds that can finance major capital expenditures. And believe it or not, certainly the larger air navigation providers like NAV Canada, like NATS, like DFS, have investment-grade bond ratings. I mean, the financial market says, yeah, this is a sustainable kind of a thing. This is a good investment. These are likely, assuming that the projects they invest the money in make sense and actually have a business case, these are going to be sound investments, and we recommend that people buy those bonds. Over 50 countries have made this transition in the last 25 years. And we now have studies, 3 or 4 major studies looking at the performance, and they're all performing well. And almost all of the measurable parameters are better after the transition than before the transition. And ICAO itself has policies saying this is a good idea, in fact, that there should be organizational separation between safety regulation and air traffic service provision. So there's a case out there, and this has been recommended many times. Air Transport Association in 1986 made the first significant, serious study proposal for this kind of a change. The Clinton-Gore administration proposed the U.S. Air Traffic Services Corporation, and Norm Mineta introduced the enabling legislation in 1994. NATCA, in fact, endorsed that transformation, didn't gain traction, partly because the aviation community, I think, unlike today, was completely at odds with one another and divided and was not able to coalesce around it and tell Congress, you've got to do this because the status quo isn't working. It's working much less than it is today. So that's basically the message. I think that's the conversation that we really, really do need to have. And it's time to get busy working on a U.S. version of what's becoming the state of the practice around the world.
Thank you, Bob. Next to Bob is Nick Calio, the President and CEO for Airlines for America.
Thanks, Steve. I'm at the happy point where almost everything's been said, so notes are meaningless. So I would like to start, though, by thanking both ALPA and NATCA for, number one, holding this conference. Number two, for inviting our participation. And number three, in light of all the talk today about collaboration and partnership, the partnership and collaboration that we've had in recent years, it's been terrific. When we go in places together to see legislators or policymakers and speak with one mind about the state of the industry and what needs to be done for the industry, because we all do well together or all do not so well together, it means something. So thank you both. I'm going to make just a couple points about NextGen in the near term. Airlines are willing to support NextGen infrastructure if we can show economic or operational benefits. That hasn't always been the case so far. More often than not, it hasn't. Lee talked about, airplanes going to the boneyards with a lot of aviation or avionics on it that were never able to be used. And that has to be fixed, or there's really no business case for airlines which are in business to invest any more than they already have. To realize the NextGen dream, the FAA's got to show some short-term benefits to the stakeholders and ensure that they can gain confidence in the FAA's ability to deliver the goods, if you will. If that doesn't happen, you're not going to see the desire to go further than we are. We have equipment on the airplanes now that could be used, is not being used. If we could do that in the short term, I think the long term would look much more promising. And that gets to the point that Lee was making about the need for a national airline policy, the state of the industry, and the overly burdensome tax and regulation and fees on the industry. We can't bear much more. And as a key stakeholder, that's got to be looked at in context. So you've got to find a way to pay for it, and then I'll get to funding in a second. I would say that getting it done is not so much a function right now of how much money you throw at it. It's a function of good stakeholder teamwork, and I have thought for some time in my brief time relatively in the industry, strong central leadership that can make binding decisions when things bog down. My experience in government suggests to me, and there may be cases where people think we've had this, I don't see it myself. You need somebody in charge of NextGen who has the authority to kick down doors, and when somebody says, no, we can't do that, or no, we're not going to do that, to make them accountable for it. That, I think, would push things along. You only need a few good examples before people start to sit up a little bit. And as Bill Ayer was talking about, lights that were supposedly green that went to red might turn green. So I think that is something we need to look at. If you could show these short-term benefits, it's the low-hanging fruit. We could do some things in the next few years that would gain the confidence or instill the confidence that I've been talking about. It really should not be that difficult. The difficulty will come later with very expensive new NextGen programs. But again, if you've shown an economic benefit and you can continue to show an economic benefit to make the business case, airlines will buy into that. We're in business. If you can show, if you can do well for your customers, if you can do well for the environment, if you can do that, it makes all the sense in the world to do it. If you can't, it's a very different story. Now, in that regard, in terms of funding, we do have a problem. People say the FAA should run this like a business, and they should. To run something like a business, one of the things you need is a steady funding stream. You can't have the stop, start, stop, start. You also need, and this all deals with where I'm going to in sequestration, you need the flexibility to deal with points where business is low, where you do have funding cuts. This notion of the anomalies, budget anomalies like the AIP, and all the whole laundry list, and this has nothing to do with AIP, but there's this whole area of the budget that's been hived off and isn't subject to sequestration, meaning that the FAA is absorbing a disproportionate share of the funding cuts. And we believe, A4A believes, as I know that ALPA does, that the FAA has the authority or the discretion to move money around. If they don't, we need to find it in the short term. In the long term, we need to find a different funding mechanism. And I do think the private markets are a way to look. My reputation, I think, over the long haul has been that I'm pretty straightforward. I think that Lee and Paul take that to the next level, which is great to get this out on the table. It is a discussion we need to have. If the current system is broken, you just don't keep it and stick with it, particularly in light of everything that we all know is coming that's been talked about here earlier today. There's going to be an increase in travel. There's going to be more planes. We've got greater foreign competition, which plays into it. We need the best system in the world. We need to be the leader in the world in aviation. Part of that, as we've been fighting for, is the national aviation policy. A key portion of that, or pillar of that, is the best air traffic control system. So, thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And next to Nick is Roger Cohen, president of the Regional Airline Association.
Thanks a lot. I really want to thank again ALPA and NATCA for inviting us, and real special thanks to our friends at ALPA for your strong support of our recent convention in Montreal, and hope all of you join us next year in St. Louis. One of the things we did in Montreal is we raised a record amount of money for our scholarship program for young aviation students, and Lee personally was the #1 contributor to that fund. And I'm going to share a little secret with you right now that whatever story he told you about how he got that brace on his leg, he really got it tripping over everybody to be the last guy in the silent auction. So, but thank you, Lee. Really, it was great. As Scott, my colleague, opened up this morning, it's real important to have the regional perspective in this. We operate 50% of the flights in the country, but more importantly, there's 500 U.S. communities in this country. That's 3/4 of all the cities with any service have service exclusively from regional airlines. And to these communities, that service is just as important, if not more important, than an internet connection. And that's why we've got to continue to make air service as much a national priority as broadband or anything else. I'm not a pilot, but I do kind of share, I think, a unique personal perspective, because I've actually had a 50-yard line seat and been a kibitzer on the sidelines on this debate about funding of ATC since I got here in 1988. And I saw the Wendell Ford bill that led to the Belial's Commission, which said that FAA could safely split the duties from operating the system. The Gore Commission, where it said that the users of the system should fund its development and operation, but I stress here, should not cause any undue economic disruption on any one sector. The whole, during the Bush administration, the rekindling of the debate on privatizing the system. And I'm going to share another story in typical DC hired gun fashion. So I spent 15 years at ATA trying to cook up reasons why privatizing the system was a good idea. And I spent 2 years at the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association rabble-rousing why it was the end of Western civilization. So I do have kind of, I guess I have worn both hats on this one. Hold on that thought. I think it's important, though, to fast forward to today as it relates to the regional industry, because when these debates began, here's where we are today. We went from carrying about 40 million passengers a year to 160. That's a 400% increase. Our RPMs have increased 1,000% in that period. As Scott pointed out today, regionals comprise more than half the flights at the most crowded airports, and that's Philadelphia, National, LaGuardia, Minneapolis, St. Paul. We're more than 60% at O'Hare and Houston and Dulles and Detroit, and even those places that you don't associate with regional airlines, LAX and San Francisco, for example, crowded airspace, we're more than 1/3 of the flights. And here's the most important point, though, where I think we've come a long way, is that our regional leaders, our CEOs of our airlines, are really now and have been deeply engaged in this whole issue. Brian Bedford of Republic Airlines was on the LaHood Fact Commission. Chip Childs, the CEO of SkyWest, and Phil Trineri before him, a former Pinnacle CEO, are on the MAC. Jim Rankin of Air Wisconsin, a very active member of the NAC. All of them are pilots, which also sets them apart, I think, from a lot of other CEOs. All of them licensed pilots. But the most passionate about the benefits of NextGen is Dan Wolf, who is a full-time Massachusetts state senator, president of Cape Air, and they fly the smallest airplanes, piston airplanes, 9-seaters. And he is the most passionate in talking about the benefits of NextGen. And as everybody in this room recognizes, and as everybody has talked about today, the lessons we've learned from sequestration, I think we really have reached the tipping point. that we can no longer count on the U.S. government to provide a reliable and predictable funding stream for this absolutely critical infrastructure project, which is funding the air traffic control system. So in saying that, let me just put up a real small yellow light. That's not a red light, but a yellow light. The current business model that is in the commercial aviation industry doesn't lend itself right now to a one-size-fits-all funding stream. And this is a lesson that Canada has successfully looked at, had to overcome, and is fixed, and that in order to preserve the service to all of those communities, that this funding pie gets split so that it doesn't disadvantage smaller aircraft that absolutely need to serve these smaller communities. So as long as that is out there, I do believe that the debate has changed quite a bit, and look forward to sharing more about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. And on the far left, last but not least, Ed Bolen, President and CEO, National Business Aviation Association.
Well, thanks, and I'll just repeat my thanks to Lee and Paul for convening this and giving us an opportunity to talk about the importance of NextGen and moving forward and keeping the U.S. air transportation system the best in the world. I have the opportunity, the privilege and pleasure of representing the business aviation community, which is a very important part of our air transportation system and a very important part of our nation's economy. We're 1.2 million jobs, a lot of important manufacturing jobs in the United States. We're an industry that contributes positively to our nation's balance of trade. And we're an economic lifeline to a lot of communities around the United States with little or no commercial airline service. NBAA's got roughly 10,000 members. 85% of those members are small and mid-sized companies, typically using their airplane to do things they can't accomplish with other modes of transportation. Having said that, they are some of the biggest purchasers of commercial airline tickets in the United States. The business aviation community for a number of years has been very, very enthusiastic and involved in trying to move toward NextGen. A lot of that is for parochial reasons. What we have seen over the years is when airports and airspace gets very crowded, we tend to get pushed out to secondary and tertiary airports. A lot of you probably remember, when Midway was a great general aviation airport, or Florida Executive was a great general aviation airport, Mineta up in San Jose. What we see is that when things get congested, we get pushed out. So NBAA, and I think the whole general aviation community, has been very supportive of trying to find ways that we can increase our system's throughput, enhance the capacity of our system to make sure we have access to airports and to airspace. We've been very supportive because of the environmental benefits of NextGen. And we've been very supportive of NextGen because of what we see as the safety benefits, the better situational awareness that allows us to enhance safety. And so NBAA, and really the rest of the general aviation community, has been very involved in all of the efforts to move forward on NextGen. In fact, I had the opportunity to sit on the Future of the U.S. Aerospace Commission back 10 or 12 years ago when NextGen was being proposed as a national imperative. So this is something we've been excited about for a long time, and I'm enthusiastic about some of the progress that we are now beginning to see. And I agree with Bill, whose comments this afternoon at the lunch suggested we've made a lot of progress. It may not be as fast as we wanted, but we're beginning to see tangible evidence that we're moving forward. We may be moving toward that tipping point. And I think it's accurate to say that what happens over the next 12, 18, 24 months is pretty important on whether we get across the goal line or we go backwards. These are, by any standard, really tough, challenging, difficult times in Washington, D.C. A lot of people, and I go around the country all the time, there's kind of a belief that Washington's broken. Need to blow it up, need to go do something else. This is just a terrible way to try to run a country. And that's understandable in a lot of ways. But, it's been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others. And I think as we begin to look forward to what we have and what the alternatives are, we ought to keep in mind that while we may have a lot of warts and a lot of problems that need to be addressed, simply chucking a system and moving to something else may not necessarily be the answer. I think it's important to have the debate. I think it's important to know where we are, what the options are for moving forward. But I think there's a lot that we need to be careful of as we're having this debate. We need to understand that today the U.S. runs the largest, the most sophisticated, the most diverse, and the safest air transportation system in the world. It's the most efficient system in the world. It's the largest system in the world. And we need to be careful on steps we take as we try to move it forward. The United States, as you know, has been a world leader in all aspects of aviation, and past performance, as my broker has always told me, is no indication of the future. I'm hoping that'll be true at some point during this recession, but we need to make sure that the U.S. is the world leader. I think Nick was right on point on saying that. We need to think through how we move forward. Canada, for example, has 10% of the U.S. population. It's got an economy that's about 10% of the U.S. It's got an air transportation that's about about 5% of the U.S. So on a per capita basis, on a per economy basis, it's not what the U.S. is. And I think that's repeated in other parts of the world. As this debate has gone on through the years, a couple of things that I've noticed have proven to be very present. Our system does have problems that need to be addressed, and some of those were articulated a long time ago in this debate. Some of those have not improved. Some of those have gotten worse. But some of the things haven't quite played out the way people expected. There was a lot of talk when this idea of privatization was first mentioned back in the 80s and 90s, and the idea on it was we need a stable and predictable funding system. The system that we have today is just not reliable. But the reality is, if you go back and look at funding for the FAA over the last 15 years, what you will see is an almost unbroken line of increases. Increases despite the fact that we had a tech bubble burst, increases despite the fact that we had terrorist attacks. We stood up the Department of Homeland Security. We fought 2 wars. We had Katrina. Every year, I'm told there's a new reason why funding for the FAA is going to go away, and a primary part of that funding going away is going to be the general fund contribution. I remember hearing 7 or 8 years ago that the general fund contribution is at 20%, it's going down to 16, then it's going to 11, and then it's going away. So don't have any idea that the general fund is going to be around, and if you suggest it is, you're naive. Today, the general fund contribution is over $4 billion. It's over 25% of the funding. I think before we give up on the system, we ought to say, look, where's that $4 billion going to come from? Is that going to be new taxes on the industry? Is it going to be significant cuts and closures? How exactly is this going to work? It doesn't mean it can't, but it's a pretty big hole to start with when you say what we need is really more funding, we need more revenues to move forward. It seems a tough way to start by going and saying, let's get rid of the first $4 billion into the coffers. Now, I know it comes with strings attached. I know Congress isn't always easy to deal with, but I think we need to think through what happens to that general fund contribution. This year, the general fund contribution in fiscal year 13 was $4.6 billion. Sequestration was $600 million. That takes us down to $4 billion. That's still a big hole. The proposed budget for fiscal year 14 has got the general fund contribution going down to $3.2 billion. That's going to be the government's request, although we have seen through the years that Congress generally gives more in general fund contribution than the industry asks for. $3.2 billion is a lot of years of sequestration cuts before you say, okay, now we're even. And let me be clear, sequestration does not look very palatable from the general aviation community. 148 towers closing, 10% furloughs. This is not pleasant. And the first taste, I think we were all pretty repelled. And I think when we begin fiscal year 14, someone's going to say, you didn't like that taste, but here's a second helping. These are not easy times. I'm not suggesting there are no problems. Don't worry, be happy. We got a lot of work to do. All I'm suggesting is today the U.S. has the world's best air transportation system, largely thanks to a lot of people in the room today. We have a Congress that, while it drives us crazy, has provided pretty stable funding. Every member that I represent has had their funding go like this through economic downturns. The FAA's funding has stayed stable or gone up. I think we need to be careful that we look before we jump, that we have discussions like this, and we make sure that collectively we all do what we know we need to do, which is take the steps necessary to keep the U.S. the world leader.
Thanks, Ed. I think I have just a question. I think we need to keep in mind that our goal is, all of our goal is to maintain the safest, most efficient aviation industry in the world. And with that in mind, and given the budget turmoil that we have, even though it's steady and even growing, the starts and stops and the 3-month extensions and wondering what's going to happen in all those increments, it does have an effect. And if you were king for a day and you could make changes, whether it stay the same, whether it's completely privatized, whether it's some form of government corporation, whether it's just reforming the tax code, what would you do? And we'll start with Lee.
Oh, great. I like the whole notion of being king for the day. But I just want to piggyback on something said down here, and then it'll help answer the question. Look, unlike my colleagues, I'm new to Washington still, a few years. And the thing that I found in Washington, there are a lot of cynics here. Not my colleagues, but the cynics here are the ones that they start out every sentence by, okay, we'll have a conversation, but let's agree to do no harm first. Because they've seen that happen so often. And if you look at what we're trying to do here, is we have to do something. And the time to do something is right now, because if we don't do something, we're watching proposals coming out of the administration that are not palatable. Whether it's a $100 per segment tax for debt relief, when we have infrastructure holes that we need to fill, we as a group, the users, we need to be having this discussion. So I don't think I'd get an argument now to answer this question, that if we could just have a conversation on tax and fee reform, I don't think I'd get much of an argument that the current system with 17 different unique taxes and fees, if you were creating the system with this group of people, that's not the system we would have, okay? And what's going on now, the reason why, I believe, one of the primary reasons that small communities are losing service is because of unsustainable taxes and fees and gas, okay? Small community service is important. We need to be mindful of that. Great point made by 50% of the takeoffs and landings come out of the RAA. Another point is that's just a small part of the available seat miles that reside over here with Airlines for America. So if you take a look at the business aircraft and general aviation, what they provide to the U.S., one of these taxes would have, this $100 tax would be an incredible, cause incredible damage to them. Okay, but then there would be others that would say that, well, you know, it's not so big, it can always get worse. The bottom line is, it's time to have a discussion. What we would all like would be a fair and equitable system. Take a look at that and not be distracted by, and I understand there's probably another discussion on privatization, but not be distracted by privatization. Let's first figure out how to properly fund the system, something that makes sense, and something that can't be unilaterally hijacked by having the immigration fee doubled or the agricultural fee doubled. It's not a tax, we're just doubling it because, you know, we got to check those plants a little better. Or the security fee, because, you know, you can't argue with security. Can't argue with that. Let's double or triple that security fee. But those are taxes that are not clearly passed on to the consumer. And again, just to throw the cards face up on the table, if you try to point that out, there is an agency that is quick to say, hey, we don't want you putting those taxes like that on your websites. We prefer you don't talk about that. You know, so the bottom line is I'd say, hey, with the people that are in the system and know what we need to go forward without all the ancillary issues coming into it, let's have a good discussion on what would be the tax structure and how that tax structure could be modified going forward. And that would be king of the day. I'd do that.
King of the day. I'm not sure I'd focus on aviation issues, but let's just.
Is that the genie? Is that the genie in the
Just
bottle?
saying.
All right. Now
But if I only had to be king of the day and focus on aviation issues, and being the only somewhat FAA insider in here, I would find a way to make, and Randy Babbitt used to use this term, find a way to make the FAA a high-functioning bureaucracy and streamline the lines of business and open the collaboration across lines of business within the FAA so that not everybody cares about their little turf of what they're supposed to be doing on their desk, but actually cares about the big picture of safely and efficiently moving airplanes from point A to point B and advancing technology. And that goes from, it's just a giant bureaucracy, and please don't take this as bashing current FAA leadership. I think they have done an outstanding job and will continue to do an outstanding job of a massive bureaucracy in which they inherited. And it's really hard to streamline it. Randy Babbitt really tried, David Grizzle has tried tremendously, and so has Michael Werta, and I'm sure they're going to continue to try to streamline the bureaucracy. But if I was king for the day and I had to focus on aviation issues, it would certainly be somehow to make the FAA a high-functioning bureaucracy, which in turn might actually fix the funding mechanism, because I know there's a lot of internal waste that you really just can't put a dollar sign on because of the cross bureaucracy that goes on in there. So.
Well, my bottom line is that you can come up with the most beautiful, perfect structure of funding that's fair to everybody and doesn't disadvantage everyone, but as long as it's a tax that's paid to the Treasury and then has to be appropriated annually by members of Congress with all of the constraints on them and all of their various interests, we're going to have a fundamental problem. We don't fund airports that way, other than AIP, which is a very small part of most airports funding. We don't fund electric utilities that way. We don't fund any other large effort. People pay bills directly to the infrastructure provider. And the infrastructure provider then goes about its business. It has some kind of external regulation in the public interest, especially where it has a monopoly. But we have a model that's the wrong model. I mean, I think we learned from history what works and what doesn't work. And I mean, we've seen in places like Canada, most of the same large bureaucracy, large for Canada, was there before it became NAV Canada and is still there afterwards, but their incentive structure, their ability to directly serve their customers and focus on what makes sense to the customers, what's the business, what actually meets a business case. Now that's their focus. Before, they got their money from the Canadian Parliament, and they had to respond to them. And that's what FAA has to do, because that's the nature of the beast. So I think until we fix the model, all the talk about, the perfect funding system is not going to solve the problem. It may be better than the hodgepodge we have, but as long as Congress can play political games with it, as long as it has to come in annual appropriations, I think we're still going to have a problem.
I'm not going to speak for you, Roger, but we both immediately thought the same thing. If we could be king for a day, the Cleveland Indians would win the World Series, and the Browns would win the Super Bowl. But since
I'll settle for one.
You're easy. But since we are focused on aviation, I, of course, would go big. I would say that I would have our government writ large look at our entire industry and all of our employees and everybody together and say that we need to treat this industry as the strategic asset it is, and because that's all about American jobs, the American economy, comfort for our customers that, you guys are flying around, you guys are directing around, and that, they're on our airplanes. And it would subsume most of what we talked about. It would certainly be Lee's notion on taxes and fees, because it's a ridiculous system that's been put together without any thought whatsoever about the overall impact on customers, demand, and the ability of the industry to continue. It would deal with regulations that don't make any sense, which Lee also mentioned. It would certainly involve NextGen. And however we fixed it, if I were king, it would just happen, right? Because I could will it to happen. That would involve reform at the FAA. It would reform the system, finding the right kind of funding for it. And it would also take a look at foreign competition and what we're doing inside our government that makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Certainly wouldn't be things like putting a pre-clearance facility in Abu Dhabi for a whole variety of reasons, because it benefits no American consumer or airline, and a whole variety of other things. So it would be the creation of a national airline policy that would treat this industry the way it should be treated and the way it's treated by some other countries who are buying up planes like they're popcorn.
Thanks.
Not even a king could give Cleveland a championship and everything, I'm beginning to believe. There's some higher power, but I haven't experienced since I was 12 years old. But I think most importantly, if I were king, the key thing that we haven't really touched on is to keep on, right, knock on wood, the contributions and the efforts of every single person in this entire industry, that we are right now in the safest period in aviation history. That, I think, is, if I were king, that would be the one wish that I would just, that would be, I would just decree it forever, in the land. On this particular issue, I actually think we've come such a long way. And because, like I say, I've talked out of both sides of my mouth on this issue, that the fact that we're all up here, I think that we've said, okay, look, we're going to go out to dinner together. Where are we going to go, and how are we going to divide up the check? I think that there is a growing recognition that that's where we are. And if somebody doesn't come along, well, you're going to miss out on the fun. And hopefully we won't get in when we split up the check, you had the tuna fish and you had this, and it's not going to be anything like that. But for the first time ever, I feel very optimistic that this debate has gotten off the dime, which is really where it's been stuck, since, almost since I started in this business.
Thanks. Ed?
I might vote for Nick to be king. I thought his
You don't vote for king.
Well, I still might like his platform.
Are you saying he's not king? I thought that was a given. I didn't waste.
I do think helping make aviation a national priority is pretty fundamental, and it's a frustration for all of us because, if there's anything that divided government ought to be able to agree on, it's transportation infrastructure, because this is what facilitates commerce, employs a lot of people. It makes everything else happen. And when you look at the way aviation does get treated sometimes, it's a huge frustration. So making it a priority, I think, would be right up there on my list. I do make a couple comments because, Bob's talked about privatization, and we've got some concerns about privatization that we've articulated over the years, but also some concerns about user fees. And so, as I think all of you know, general aviation, business aviation, contributes through fuel taxes. And fuel taxes are really good for our industry. That doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form they're good for others. I think some of the mistakes that get made sometimes is people sometimes look at business aviation and say it's just like the commercial airlines, and it's not. And sometimes I think people make mistakes saying it's completely different than the commercial airlines. Well, we've got some similarities too. But when we look at paying the fuel tax, it's easy, it's simple, it's fast, and it's efficient. And for companies that are not in aviation to make money on aviation, that's pretty good. It's very similar to when you drive your car and you're filling up the fuel tank. There's been a lot of concerns in our industry about, the administrative burden that comes with trying to handle invoices, trying to process them. I think the airlines made a comment up at ICAO in 1993 that said it cost them $85 to $125 to process an invoice. Well, that's a lot of money for an organization that's not in the transportation system. We probably can't process them as efficiently as the airlines can. So that's a concern. Another concern that we've had is the bureaucracy necessary to oversee and do the funding, the billing, the collection, the audits, and so forth of a user fee system. It seems to us that at least some portion of the money that goes in on a user fee system then has to be used to fund the collection of more fees, whereas this kind of goes directly from the pump into the trust fund and into the system. So I'm not suggesting that this works for others, but from our experience, we've looked at it and really come to the conclusion that anything a user fee can do, for us, the fuel taxes do better. They approximate weight, they approximate distance flown, they create an incentive not to go to congested airports at congested times. They allow people to kind of pick the kind of product they plan to fly, and they cost nothing to collect. So we see a lot of value in that as a funding system, and I know that there are challenges on trying to figure out how we would do a fuel tax and still use it to fund infrastructure problems. But I think it's important to know where we come from and where we think the debate ought to go.
Thank you. I know we had a...
I just wanted to throw one thing in that, you know, when we go back 20, 25 years and you're talking about the debate then, and you take the debate forward, you know, the U.S. airline industry, prior to deregulation in the industry today is significantly different. And one point that I think we shouldn't miss is we've just gone through domestic consolidation, but we're on the cusp of international consolidation and international competition, and the costs to compete internationally are incredible. And so anything we're doing with our U.S. national airspace, we have to recognize that there are state-owned enterprises, that their governments are investing in the infrastructure in those countries that allow them to compete better internationally and better even in the U.S. airspace. So we can no longer just look at it that we're isolated in the world. We have to think globally, and that in this discourse we're having has to take that into account. It's just not enough to say as they cross the border, they're paying into our private system. You have to think that we're competing with internationally state-owned enterprises to our own detriment, and we have to think it through carefully. So.
And let me go one step further than Lee did on foreign governments investing in infrastructure, aviation infrastructure. Foreign governments invest in something that's a lot more important than infrastructure. They invest in the human capital of their aviation business. If you go to any aviation university in this country, good proportion of the students are there they're being subsidized 100% by their foreign government. And to get funding for an aviation student in this country, you probably go to Barber College easier than that. And that's just not right. And so that even underscores that. I would like to take a second when we talk about national priority. Sometimes we've got to celebrate our victories. And they may not be pretty how we got there. But if you think about it, just a couple of months ago, less than 2 months ago, because of the work of everybody in this room, the U.S. Congress, 100 to nothing in the U.S. Senate, and what was it, 400 to 30 or something like that in the House, something like that, in about 4 days, fixed to keep the system running. They fixed it. And they haven't done that for anybody else or anything else, because I think that is the best message, that at least, when push comes to shove, they do recognize, we hope, and it's our job to make sure that they continue to recognize it, it is the fundamental driver to the U.S. economy. So.
Thanks. Anybody else? Any follow-up? All right, so I'd like to see if there's any questions from the audience. Probably not. Anybody? Do we have any text questions there, Chris?
We do. We have a couple. Let's see. First one for Captain Moak. You mentioned the national aviation policy. can you give us some thoughts on what that policy would entail and how it might be developed?
Well, you know, we push this leveling the playing field and everything matters in national airline policy, national aviation policy. And, you know, the idea comes down to all these random acts that are not connected, that have an impact on the profitability, the sustainability of the airline industry. The randomness has to stop. And the only way to do that is by the industry banding together to come up with priorities so that we can have action taken and get above the noise of what I guess we've all been calling the bubble here in Washington lately. Having all the individual actions, whether it's the airports or it's the airlines or it's labor or it's the controllers or it's consumer groups, all going into Congress with their one issue, gives Congress the perfect platform to do nothing. So if we focus on the things that we agree on and then execute on those as priorities, we can actually get things done, I believe, in Washington. And that lends itself to having a national airline, a national aviation policy.
Anybody else have anything to add to that? Any questions from the audience? If not, Sean's going to buy somebody a polo. Come on. Oh, coming over here. There's a mic right up front here. Sorry.
It's going to be a follow-up to Captain Moak. Regarding what you just said, getting all the constituencies together to take a united front in front of Congress, that's a good business approach, I believe. So with that in mind, I think the end user, the consumer, is what we all work for. And often they're not the ones that we have on board to help us in our cause. And I think that's an area we need to work on.
I'd say don't lose sight of the customer. You know, everybody's focused on the customer, as we always should be. You know, the impact to customers over the last, since 9/11 has been dramatic. I think we're trend positive right now with all facets of aviation. And I think we can continue that way, staying mindful of that. We can continue that way if we have aviation policy that allows us to be profitable across all segments of the industry. It's important.
I think part of that is education as well. You know, everybody works off of their last flight and don't think about the larger context. And when you see service being cut to large, what I call large-size medium cities, you realize what's coming down the line, because that is another trend. So I think we're very focused on our customers and on consumers. They're not this big mass that's going to rise up on most issues. They were extremely helpful on sequestration, however. We started a website on a Friday night, and we got a ton of help with people sending letters and messages to congressmen about the need to get something done in the face of administration, either recalcitrance or inability to do it. You're not going to find an issue like that every day, but A4A is looking at ways to try to continue to educate consumers about what their circumstances are and how they're impacted when they fly, both in terms of what they're flying on, what they're paying to fly. You know, the biggest success we've had is when we come out with ads and talk to people about the 17 taxes and fees, and your normal $300 round trip ticket being $61 in federal taxes and fees. They think that's all going to the airlines. And that could be going back into the business, you know, and certainly we've got to pay the government some for the service provided. Nonetheless, that seems a little high.
You know, I do think there is a lot of commonality on a lot of issues up here, Lee, and I think, you know, you kind of brought that up, that we're talking together now. And, you know, I remember listening to Dave Barger on the NAC talk about us all being part of the same ecosystem and recognizing that, you know, it's really tough to kind of cleave off different parts and think that this ecosystem is not going to feel the impact. And what has been, I think, encouraging to me is to see how our community has come together to address some challenges that we've had, whether it's the EU ETS, some of the sequestration issues. You know, there's kind of a growing recognition. I think everybody in general aviation recognizes the huge value that commercial airlines bring to the system, but I think more and more commercial airlines are recognizing a lot of the pilots come through the general aviation ranks. A lot of the controllers are coming through the general aviation ranks. There's really a lot that unites us, and things like the environmental issues, the safety issues, moving forward on NextGen, I think have brought us together and at least brought an awareness that we can't move forward at the expense of each other, but we can move forward by working together on a lot of stuff. And that just, to me, underscores how powerful events like today are and what a privilege it is to be able to be part of this.
Just on your point there, government policy, if there's anything I've learned, government policy matters. And although we all don't agree on every issue, but you really can't make this up that Nick brought up earlier, that we're paying taxes and our government is actually going to fund an Abu Dhabi pre-clearance facility for a country that is flush in cash and to a destination that a U.S. airline doesn't fly to. You can't make that up, okay? Now, whether we agree or disagree, some of our airlines are at a disadvantage because there's a government subsidy related to aircraft financing. We should be having a discussion on that, on how we do that when those planes are put in service against our U.S. carriers on the same routes. There are other things like that are government issues that occur, like taxation. All those things matter whether you're going to be able to compete globally. And if we think we can just hunker down here and it's all going to go away, I can assure you that it's not. And if we go our separate ways, there's someone down the block here that's more than happy to put another fee, another tax. We'll reduce the debt with it because, the airlines are all flush in cash. Look at those bag fees, look what they're doing. If we're not smart in having this conversation and making our points known, by the way, last time I checked, there's no investment grade airline in the U.S. There's probably one, but last time I checked. But they're all flush in cash today. That's the narrative you're hearing out of the administration. So we have to get together, and we have to come up with a plan, and we have to try to push it forward, or someone will do it for us.
And government policy matters. I'll take that to the extreme. There's not another industry out there where the government action matters more than aviation, let alone the touch points of TSA and the getting frisked for picking up the APHIS and all this kind of stuff. But our asset cannot take off or land, cannot move. What business can't move its asset without the okay and total control of somebody from the federal government? And that's essentially what we've got right now. And so there's not even the nuclear power guys are like that, I think. There's no other industry that's more affected by government policy than aviation.
Cleveland Indians and nuclear power. I like that.
Go ahead, Bob.
But the Indians would be more important.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, to appreciate ALPA and NATCA putting this event together and having all of us here to discuss it. And I, as an observer, acute observer of aviation policy for about 25 years now, I have never seen a time when the aviation stakeholder community was as coming together in a common purpose. We don't all agree completely about what to do, about how to fund this sort of thing, but having the conversation and realizing that we need to have the conversation and work together to come out with something that's better than what we have now, I think is a huge step in the right direction. And the NAC has been, just from everything that I've seen, just a tremendous thing. We've never had anything like that before, of all of aviation working together to figure out how to do NextGen in a sensible way. And as I think we're living in very unusual times.
All right, thanks. I think we have another question come in off the text.
Yeah, we have a couple, Steve. This one came in for the whole panel, so however you want to handle it. But the question is, would a private company deal with budget reductions like sequestration or cost-cutting measures differently from the way the FAA does?
Yes.
How about we give that to Nick to start off?
Yeah, of course it would, or of course a private company would. It would look at its entire budget, it would judge its priorities, short-term priorities and long-term priorities, and take out and look at what it had to fund in terms of making the investment and what it was going to produce for the company and the shareholders over the longer term. You would try to protect the most important parts. You just wouldn't say 10% across the board and walk away. You know, it's much easier to do that, but the implications of doing so are that you're going to undercut what your goals and planning should have provided that you wanted to do in terms of execution, to follow on what Bill was saying.
And a private company would have never furloughed its frontline safety professionals for a few days. It would have met its obligations of its operations.
You got to follow on, Bob?
We have an interesting empirical case of NAV Canada when, after 9/11, when air travel just really shrank, and they're entirely funded by fees paid, charged to the users, and that fee revenue went down significantly, 10 or 15%. So fortunately, NAV Canada is allowed to have something they call a rate stabilization fund, whereby some of the revenue they take in every year is set aside in a reserve fund, basically, in order to make it not necessary, for the most part, to raise their fees to keep the cash flow coming in, to keep everybody employed during downturns, which we know happen, and after 9/11 was one of the worst ones. But they got through that with minimal rate increases. And for the last 8 years, thanks in part to having the rate stabilization fund, they have not had a rate increase in 8 years, if you look at their latest annual report, through all the ups and downs that we've had in the last 8 years. So, I mean, there's an actual data out there that says, here's how a user-funded entity can be run. It's not everybody's done that, but they have, and that's a great example, I think.
Yeah, but not to be negative about NAV Canada, we represent the pilots that fly up there. But just to be precise on one part of it, there's around 60 airports, remote airports that run across the top that are critical to those small communities up there. And we've been working with the Canadian government, with NAV Canada, to ensure that they have state-of-the-art approaches. Now, they do at the diamond mines, but they don't at the Inuit villages.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the point is, there are other problems
Sure,
there. It
sure.
isn't perfect, and
Right.
it's
No,
important.
I wouldn't, I'm the
it's
last one
important
to
to
say
note
that their system is perfect. I'd say
Right.
they've had a lot of success, and we can learn from the success and try to build a model that's tailored to the United States, to the much larger and more diverse GA community that we have in the United States, for example. But there's a lot of success there that we can learn from and build on and tailor to what we think it needs to be done.
Can I take the corporate analogy one point further? Say for some reason that a 10% cut had to be made, and for whatever reason, bylaws, some kind of restriction, the board had previously put on, take your pick, that the company felt it didn't have the discretion to actually do anything but a 10% cut across the board. What a private company would then do would be to go to its board and say that this isn't going to work for these purposes. Here's what the outcomes are going to be if we have to handle it this way. Please help us find the discretion to make the cuts. We'll get you the number, but we're going to do it in a smart way.
And my private view is that that's what Michael Huerta wanted to do. Right. And as any skilled professional in that position would have wanted to do, but was politically constrained because this is a politically run operation. And what I think we need to do, we need to depoliticize something that's as vitally as important as air traffic control and make it more sustainable.
So I'd just like to add on that. And again, I think the analogy is true I'm going to make. The national airspace is important, and it's strategically important to the United States, not unlike the coastline of the U.S. And so we haven't had this debate on the U.S. Coast Guard, and I don't want to get into all the details of that, but the point I want to make here is if the national airspace was allowed to go bankrupt, a private company like NAV Canada, if we compare the strategic importance of guarding our borders with our airspace, I think you can at least make the business case that there should be money coming from the general fund to run the national airspace. I just believe that. I don't think it should be a pay-only system for people who happen to fly in it. I think we have
that's part of the debate that I think that
right.
we need to have. And
Right.
in my view of the future, if you actually could separate the air traffic part of FAA and make it self-supporting, maybe with some help for small communities or something, there would absolutely be general fund money to pay for the vital safety regulatory functions of FAA. I mean, nobody is suggesting that that would be left to the market in any sort of sense. OSHA is not paid for by user fees. EPA is not paid for by user fees. Government safety regulatory agencies are an inherent function of government that's paid for out of general revenues for the great majority of the case, and I certainly agree with that.
Well, Lee, I agree with you on that security. I mean, that's a national interest. That's security. Security is a inherently governmental function, I think. So I think you're right on point on that. And I appreciate the comments that have been made about how private business would handle it, and I think those are fair enough. I will say, however, that when a bad decision was made by our federal government, we knew how to appeal the process. You know, Nick knew how to turn on the, ladies and gentlemen, here is your elected official, and we all worked that route. And while it was only a temporary solution, there are some benefits, and that's all I'm suggesting here is before we give it up and say this is stupid, let's chuck it and do something else. There are some inherent values to working with a representative government that's capable of providing general fund revenues that can keep us the world's leader in aviation. And just let's make sure we know what we're doing. Look before we jump.
All right. At the mic.
Hi, quick question. First, I'm trying very hard not to look at Lee's leg. It's very distracting. So there's been a lot of talk about taxes and all that. What I'm curious about is, almost half of the cost of NextGen are going to be on the users themselves in equipage. How burdensome is that going to be? Are these programs that will give loan guarantees and all that for the equipage expense enough? Or is this just going to be the sort of thing that it makes so much sense once the benefits roll in that everybody's going to do it anyway? Where does that stand?
It's pretty significant. And there's a trust factor here that hopefully we're starting to get over. Because historically, airlines have invested, billions of dollars on equipment, some of it sitting out in the desert that we talked about, because we weren't sure, because essentially the government wasn't able to provide the benefits that had been promised. The airlines stepped up and the government didn't, for whatever reason. So there's that trust factor that needs to get over. I think we're getting closer to that, but that still doesn't change the kind of huge, financial commitment that's going to be required of every operator, GA, commercial airlines, everybody, to operate in the system. I'm hopeful. But
Equipage mandates make no sense in A4A's view, and particularly don't make sense unless you're sure, and we still don't think, if you could ensure that the equipment that was bought would match what was going to be put on the ground, it would be one thing. You can't know that. And particularly if history is any teacher, you can't know that, which is why we thought that the mandates for 2020 are not a good thing. Because we could spend a lot of money, buy that equipment. Some people will be really happy with that. It's all great for them. And then we're going to be sitting there on our hands with nothing to do with it again.
I think, Alan, this gets to whether it's a cost or it's an investment. The cost is something versus the value of something. And I think all of us, when we look at examples like greener skies, you start thinking, well, maybe this could work. Maybe if you're looking at shorter approaches, saving a lot of fuel, maybe that makes sense. Maybe that's an investment worth making. If you look at it as we're buying stuff that we don't want to buy, it helps the government, it doesn't help us, suddenly everything starts to look real expensive. And I think that's been the debate, and I think that was the focal point. You heard Bill Ayers say today at lunch, Task Force 5. Task Force 5 was about our community coming together and say, we've already got a lot of equipment. Prove to us we can take advantage of what we've got, and then we might buy additional equipment. I mean, it was a pretty simple premise. I think we're now with NextGen beginning to see how there could be value not just to the government, but to communities, to operators, companies, and private pilots as well. So I think there's an opportunity there. You know, when in general aviation, we were very quick early adopters of GPS. Pilots intuitively knew GPS is going to help me always know where I am, help me understand better situational awareness. That was a cost that they were happy to make because they perceived themselves getting the value. And that's the question I think right now. Is the technology we're going to be forced to buy going to benefit the system, going to benefit the government, benefit operators? And I think that's the open debate.
And one way to really give you a perfect example is if we said today that you could use the equipment on the airplane with the controllers who are trained and the pilots that are trained, and you could go out here to Reagan Airport, and you could take off on Reagan, and you could fly the best climb profile, absolutely direct, and then land directly into LaGuardia. You would have a smaller carbon footprint. It would be cheaper to fly. Fuel would be less, and it would be very quick, that flight, okay? That flight currently, real quick, is taxed at 20% or more, whereas the focus of the government of high-speed rail is subsidized at $60 a ticket on that, tax subsidies. The bottom line is a 737 or an A320 on that route is high-speed rail, and if you told everybody you could do that, they would all have that equipment tomorrow. They would do it. So the capability is incredible if we can just get it out there.
Well, it goes a step further than that. I mean, we have a financial crisis in this industry every 6 months, basically. And we're looking at another one. And if you're asking people to equip because we're going to deliver, you know, these next-gen approaches or this next-gen product, if sequester stays around, that is kryptonite to next-gen. And I keep saying it, and next-gen is all but dead. If you allow this to, I mean, I was talking about the general funds now at the contributions of $4 billion, and it's going to go to 3.2. You allow this to keep getting cut, they're going to cut modernization. They're not going to cut, you know, running the current system. But more importantly, they're allowing the infrastructure to crumble around it because they need to save a penny. And that, to me, when we talk about the funding of the system or whether you should equip or non-equip, we should focus on exactly the impact that sequester is having on the current infrastructure that is being allowed to, you know, go to a fix-on fail, and oh, by the way, we're not keeping spare parts. Spare parts might take a day or two, and might shut down approaches that you want to do to LaGuardia, your high-speed rail. Forget that. How about just, you know, shutting down a runway at LaGuardia because we just don't have the equipment to run ILS approaches there? To me, when you look at the funding system, you look at sequestration, it's more than in the distance. It's tomorrow. It is here. Yes, we were very successful in April in pushing back and getting, being able to move some money from AIP. And whether they could have moved money or didn't move money or want to move money, whatever that is, I don't care about that argument. What I care about is continuing to fund the system properly so we have equipment that we can rely on. We can modernize our procedures and our equipment. We can staff these facilities properly, and we can continue to grow the national airspace system. I think the ancillary question of equipage is out there, yes, but currently, today, funding the system should be our goal. And making sure that whether it's the legislators or whether it's, you know, private companies or whatever it is, the system must stay funded properly. Because we're not, you know, you're not going to be able to drive 100,000 miles without doing that oil change. And that's basically what sequester is making us do. How far are you going to run without that, you know, without that engine breaking down?
And just if I could just add a little bit on that, sequester, as most of us know, is a 10-year program, the Budget Control Act that imposes this. So it's not something that is just another cut in at September 30th. It's 9 more fiscal years, unless Congress dramatically, you know, repeals it and comes up with some other fixes. But also, if you look at any serious projections, the Congressional Budget Office, GAO, or private forecasters, of the fiscal path of the U.S. government, it is horrendous. Talk about something that's broken. I mean, the idea that there would be large amounts of general fund money for things like the air traffic control system is just fantasy land. I mean, on the path that the U.S. government is on now, with nothing on the horizon to fundamentally change that. So if we in aviation don't fix our own house, it's going to be broken for us.
You know, having a strategic plan moving forward would be ideal for the industry as one. And just to look at closing the 149 towers in April, but then to budget it to be open in October. And the reality of that is, it sounds funny, but just think about it. Well, what are you going to do with those controls? You're just going to lay them off and you think they're just going to stay around not collecting a paycheck? Or, okay, maybe you're going to keep them on, or the facilities. What are you going to do with the facilities? Shut them down, not allow the equipment to run, and then in 6 months turn it back on, and hopefully it still works? To me, just having a blueprint of moving forward and respecting the national airspace system and understanding of the economic engine it is paramount beyond everything of equipage, non-equipage, and NextGen. We're in it right now, and if we really don't focus on, we have got to make sure as a collective, everybody up here, everybody in this room, everybody that is tied to the aviation industry, whether you're a pilot, whether you're a controller, whether you're in that business, or whether, whatever it is, you have to understand, we have got to make sure that this system is funded properly. It's that basic.
All right, so we have time for one quick question. I know Paul has a high-speed rail to catch here, so he needs to go. So at the mic.
I suspect it might be a quick answer. I was strictly for the NextGen and the idea that it ought to be maybe thought of as a capital expenditure rather than this year-by-year spending, and the idea that if there was a revenue bond type of path to do that, so that you get your $20 billion up front, pay it off over the 20 years, the airlines would see that they probably couldn't spend $20 billion that quickly to get it up and running, but the airlines would be on board and they could put the equipment on the planes. They would probably pay off the revenue bonds by tacking a fee onto the tickets, but is there a mechanism at the federal level, like a city or a state would do a revenue bond like that, to pay for NextGen that way, like a capital project rather than an operating project?
That would be better than the status quo, but I think you would find that the U.S. Treasury is very much opposed to creating any new bonding authority for existing federal agencies and would fight bitterly to prevent that from happening. Doesn't mean it's absolutely impossible, but it would be a very tough hurdle to them. That issue came up. Late Senator Stevens was a proponent of doing that, and they wanted to get a bonding authority for the FAA precisely for NextGen, and Treasury said over our dead bodies.
A lot of assumptions there. Remember, this is market. Market determines the price of the ticket. It's not so easy to pass that through, especially in light of all the other user fees and taxes that are lumped up on top of it. So it's not like you're going to an amusement park and paying for something. So just to be clear.
All right, anything else? All right, please give the panel a round of applause and thanks.